Hi, I'm Grace Lindsay. I'm a professor of psychology and data science at New York University, and today I'm going to be talking to you about macro learning. And particularly, we're talking about learning on multiple timescales. So, as you've probably seen before in this course, the environment can change over time on multiple timescales. So, some things might be universal, they might be constant and not changing. Other contexts might change slowly over time. Other parts of the world, certain latent states might change more quickly. And then we get observations that are kind of a combination of all of these different things that are changing or not changing on different timescales. Intelligent behavior requires that we adapt to these changes. If the environment is changing, then our behavior needs to change in a way that acknowledges that environmental change. So this kind of intelligent adaptation is learning. This is how we can adapt to changes in the world. We learn to do the right thing in a new context over time. So if things are changing on multiple timescales, then we need to think about mechanisms for learning to happen on multiple timescales, and that might involve different mechanisms of learning that are appropriate for different types of changes that occur on different timescales. So what are the mechanisms that can support these different kinds of learning in biological agents? For now, we're going to walk through an example that relies on perceptual depth perception. And this is going to give us an example where we can think about different types of learning that has occurred on different timescales in the visual system. So take a look at these two orbs that are 2D but kind of meant to represent 3D structures. Which way do you think these spheres are pointing? Are they concave, meaning they're going into the screen, or are they convex, meaning they look like they're coming out of the screen? So if you look at them, you might, if you were like the majority of humans and other animals even, you probably feel like the one on the left looks convex, meaning it looks like it's coming out at you, whereas the one on the right looks concave, meaning it looks like it's going into the screen. Now, as it turns out, these images are ambiguous. It's a 2D image of a 3D structure, and so we don't actually have enough information inherent in the 2D image itself to tell us completely what the 3D structure is. So in order to make this guess, in order to say that this one's convex and that one's concave, we actually have to bring in some assumptions, and one of those assumptions is that light comes from above. So if we assume that light comes from above, then this shape on the right here is convex because it looks like it's sticking out and the light would hit the part that sticks out but would cause a shadow on the part underneath, whereas this one is going into the screen, and so there's a shadow at the top but light hits the bottom inside curve. And so if we have that assumption, then labeling these things as convex and concave respectively makes sense. If we assumed, however, that light was coming from below, we'd actually give the opposite label. So the one on the left would be concave, and you could imagine, light hitting the top of this as it curved inward and a shadow being on the bottom, and then the one on the right would be convex, and you can see how that would work in terms of light hitting the part that comes out and casting a shadow underneath. So if light came from below, then that is what we would assume that these 2D images represent. So the fact that the vast majority of people and animals actually see this as convex and concave respectively means that we assume that light is coming from above. That is baked into our perceptual understanding of the world. And this makes sense because the sun, which is a major source of light, is usually above you when you see it. Don't really get sunlight coming from below you. And so it makes sense to assume that light comes from above. This is kind of a reasonable universal or constant that has been true across a long range of time. And so when it comes to these kinds of universal facts, these constants that are true across long ranges of time, what is the best way to learn about those kinds of facts? Well, if it's something that's constant for a very long time, we can use learning processes that themselves take a long time. And so, for example, the fact that the sun is above us is something that's been true since life has existed on Earth. And so it's reasonable to assume that evolution has kind of baked that information into the way that animals function. So evolution is a learning mechanism that can account for things that are true for very long periods of time. And to test whether this kind of assumption about the location of light is the result of evolution and is innate in certain animals, there was an experiment done in 1970 by Wayne Hirschberger, who raised a group of chicks in an artificial environment where light came from below. So normally in the world, as we said, light comes from above most of the time because it comes from the sun, but he took a group of chicks and from hatching, they were raised in an environment where light only came from below them. Then he was able to train these chicks to peck at different stimuli that were either concave or convex, and so this was just a way to get a readout of what the chicks think. You can't ask them, so you have to find a way to get a sense of what their subjective visual perception is. And through this, he was able to show that even the chicks that were raised with light only coming from below still had this bias that light was coming from above when it came to how they interpreted these ambiguous stimuli. And so this suggests that this belief that light comes from above is actually innate and probably hard-coded in the genes of these animals, at least in terms of this experiment with chicks. And so it makes sense, as we said, if there is knowledge or a certain type of skill that will be useful on the time scale of many, many generations, then it can be helpful to have strict genetic control of the neural systems that are responsible for encoding that information or controlling that skill. And one of the reasons this is beneficial is that it reduces the time you need to learn about the environment. If your genes can encode the neural structures that will give you good performance as soon as you're born or as soon as the neural structure is done developing genetically, then that's great because then you're immediately ready to work in the world. Now, this only works though if the information that's encoded in the genes remains true in the next generation. So that's why this needs to be information that's going to be constant across long time scales. Now, there are other forms of learning that can happen on different timescales. So in terms of this idea of assuming that light comes from above, well, it's actually been shown when people studied this more precisely that in Western cultures, people tend to assume that light not just comes from above, but also comes from slightly to the left. And this has been studied in many different ways and has been found consistently across a lot of different experiments. But one of the more interesting ways this has been demonstrated is that someone analyzed the portraits in the art museum, the Louvre, and found that 84% of the portraits actually had the light source coming from the top left, illuminating the face of the person in the portrait. That's how the painting was painted. And so this just shows that people do, in Western cultures, have this bias towards assuming that light is coming from above and slightly to the left. However, in this work from 2013, as well as kind of other works that have hinted at this, it was shown that native Hebrew readers who read from right to left as opposed to left to right as is read in English, they didn't show the same leftward bias. And so this suggests that this cultural context of the society you're raised in and the norms in terms of reading, which also influence a lot of other things about how things are arranged perceptually, those norms impact the visual system. So this is learning that is happening within a lifetime. Okay, this isn't going to be passed down from generation to generation. It's something that's learned within a lifetime on a developmental timescale. So here we have our universal of light being above, that's true across generations, and then we have this slower generational, within a generation, within a lifespan timescale of whether you're raised in a society where reading is done from left to right versus right to left, and this is another timescale on which learning can happen, and this happens during the development of the individual as they learn to read and as they learn to exist in a world that has certain statistics about how things are arranged. And that's helpful because you can adapt to that specific environment you're in and not only have to rely on these universals that were genetically encoded. Now, in addition to developmental timescale learning, we can also see examples of even faster learning that happen in a system that's already developed. So sometimes context can change in our visual world even after the visual system has developed, and we still want to be able to adapt to those. And we know that in many ways humans are capable of quickly and flexibly adapting to new visual contexts. So in this other paper from 2013, subjects learned to associate the spheres that had red lighting as being in a situation where light came from one location, and the green spheres were associated with a light source in a different location. And so that means that if you see the red spheres, you should interpret the same sort of shading differently because you know that the light source is coming from a different location. And so what they showed in this study was that people were able to learn this context dependency, and they were able to interpret these ambiguous visual stimuli differently depending on whether they were colored red or green, because they knew that that meant that a different light source location was supposed to be assumed. And so this shows really very quick learning. They were able to learn this context perceptual processing after a few hours of association between these colors and the different light sources. And they also noted that learning was best when these different trials were interleaved. So they'd see a red trial, they'd see a green trial, they'd get feedback, and they were able to learn that these different colors were associated with different locations of where the light was coming from. And so this again shows a totally different time scale of learning. So we have something like what we could consider a latent world state. So maybe, normally light comes from above, and if you're in a certain cultural context that you were raised in, maybe there's also other statistics of where light is coming from, but also in this exact moment you happen to know that light is coming from a different source than normal. It's not coming from the sun in this case, maybe it's coming from a lamp to the side of you, and you can interpret your visual scene with that knowledge. And so that's really fast learning and also quick switching between these different assumptions about the state of the world. So what are the neural mechanisms that can support all of these different timescales of learning? So we can kind of assume or think about these different types of learning and different timescales as being supported by different types of changes in the brain. Obviously, we talked about this idea of genes encoding the instructions for certain neural structures, and so kind of the broad way that the brain takes in and processes information is going to be set by those genetic controls. And then there are changes that happen over development that are a combination of the influence of genetics as well as the environment that the person is exposed to. And so we can just see here some examples of tracks in the brain changing in certain ways over the period of development. And so those are going to make changes to the broad architecture as shown here, but also changes to specific weights in terms of the connections between neurons in the brain. And that will change with development. Importantly, there are things called critical periods, and those are times where someone has to experience a certain kind of visual input in order for the visual system to be able to learn to process that information. So these are things that are changing during development in terms of broad architecture as well as specific weight values. And then when it comes to something like the red-green context experiment, we would expect to see maybe some changes in weights in that case as well, but also really quick changes in neural activity, modulation of the activity itself when you're in different contexts. So all of these different kind of parts of the brain can show different changes on different timescales, and that's how you can have a brain that supports learning on these different timescales. So to summarize this depth perception example, we saw that organisms can learn about light sources in many ways and on multiple timescales, and we can kind of broadly relate different types of learning to these different timescales. So universals, things that are almost constant or completely constant, will be learned through evolution. Things that only change the timescale of a lifespan might be learned through development, and then things that are faster can be learned with the adult system, which can be learned to be flexible within a certain range and adapt to new contexts and circumstances as needed. So that's the biological side of this idea of macro learning. But what's happening in AI? How do these kind of principles play out when we're thinking about artificial systems? Well, in artificial systems, particularly thinking about artificial neural networks, where you kind of have an input and it flows through a network through connections between different neurons, we don't necessarily see this kind of separation of learning timescales and learning mechanisms, right? In a standard machine learning setup, you define your model, you show it data, and you do something like backpropagation to update the weights in that model. But we don't really talk about those weight updates normally in terms of something like, are these weight updates meant to represent something like evolution? Are they meant to represent development? Are they meant to represent learning within an adult, a matured system? That kind of separation isn't at play in the standard machine learning setup. Sometimes people will talk about the architecture of the network as something akin to a genetic prior or something that's constraining the way that the network could work and kind of providing hints about how the network should work by putting in those architectural priors. So you see this, for example, in convolutional neural networks where the use of a 2D filter is kind of specifically meant to be helpful for things like images which have clear 2D structure in them and where you want to look for the same kind of patterns in multiple locations in the image. So sometimes we can get things that can kind of be talked about as though they're playing the role of what would have been genetically encoded in the brain in terms of the architecture and some of the hyperparameter selections for the model. A lot of times these things aren't necessarily learned though on those long time scales. They don't have that same process that evolution does. There's a phrase called gradient descent by grad student, which is meant to refer to the fact that rather than kind of learning these hyperparameters in any intelligent way, you just have a PhD student who fiddles around with things until it works. But now there have been cases where people have done things like neural architecture search where there's a more intelligent guided way to try to find architectures. So and to some extent, maybe the definition of the architecture versus the specific weights that are learned could be considered something like genetic influence versus within lifetime learning or development influence. But for the most part, we don't necessarily talk about the standard machine learning setup in these terms. But at the same time, it feels really necessary, or that it would be really useful if these kinds of things did exist in artificial systems. We know that we can train artificial neural networks to perform specific tasks really well, right? You give a network data and you set an objective function and you update the weights with backpropagation, and usually the network can learn to do the task, the exact task that it was given really well. But these networks can struggle with distribution shifts. So if something changes about the input data or the relationship between the input data to the output data, then the network's not going to work as well. So for example, if you have a network that was trained on images of fruit and it was trained on real images, if you show it a kind of clip art version, it's not going to be able to see the relationship between those things because it learned something really specific that is only present in the real images. So that kind of distribution shift means that the network isn't necessarily very flexible. It's not able to adapt to some sort of shift in its inputs, usually because these networks are trained and then held constant when they're run. And so if there is a distribution shift, there's no mechanism for the network to respond to that or learn from that in kind of a fast adaptive timescale. So we really need and want ways to make AI systems more flexible and adaptable on these multiple timescales, not just kind of the one time that they're trained where they need to try to learn everything that they'll ever encounter. We want systems that can be changed on multiple different timescales. So this idea of kind of being able to respond to shifts and to work under multiple different circumstances, this is really connected to the idea of generalization. It's, when you're generalizing, it means that you have a model that, was trained to do one thing, but can still do other things as well, right? And usually this is just tested by training on a subset of the data that you have and then testing on these held out data points, and that shows some form of generalization, but we want kind of really robust and interesting generalization as well. So generalization always requires a good representation of the data. That's what's shown here is, the purple line is not representing the broad shape of these data points very well. In this leftward example, and all the way to the right, it's kind of doing too much to try to capture all the noise in the data, but right in the middle is when you have a model that's capturing the true structure of the data, right? And so that's why this model is able to generalize well, because if you only trained on a subset of these points, it would do decently well at predicting the remaining points, whereas the linear model and the kind of over-parameterized model would give you wrong answers for different reasons. So you want that structure of the model, you want what the model is kind of learning about the structure of the data to be a good match to the real structure of the data. That's always important for generalization, and that's true here when we think about being able to adapt or continue to learn in response to new changes in the environment. If you have a linear model, even if you let that linear model update as something about the data changes, the odds that it's going to be able to match the data are low because it's just not the right model for the data structure. And the same thing is true for the over-parameterized model. The changes you can make to this model probably still won't be the right changes, or you won't be able to easily find the right changes to make if this data distribution starts to shift in some way. So you need those models that are capturing kind of inherently align with the structure of the data itself. And then another idea that comes up, as you'll see in your exercises, about this idea of learning on multiple timescales. Not only do you want the model to be able to capture, to represent the true structure of the data, you also need to think about how you represent the parameters themselves, because as we talked about the neural mechanisms of the kind of learning on multiple timescales in the brain, different parts of the brain might be the targets of different types of learning. And again, in the machine learning setup, the kind of most basic setup, we just throw all the parameters in a bag and treat them all the same way. And that might not be the best approach if we want to have learning that happens on different timescales in different ways for different purposes. We might want to be able to divide up our parameters and think about them in different ways and have different parameters change, or different components of parameters change for different types of learning. So that's something that comes up as people explore this kind of problem in artificial systems. But most importantly, I think we should note that this idea, this kind of macro learning, and it's associated with ideas of continual learning and lifelong learning, and we'll talk about meta learning. All of these ideas are really open areas of research in artificial intelligence right now, and potentially areas where we can continue to take inspiration from the brain. And you'll see some of that inspiration in your tutorials. So I hope you enjoy.